Christos anesti negrum fanato
Yeah, the misogyny was an issue back in the 80s. Thankfully, I think you're right. We don't hear that so much anymore. It's so preposterous to think that any saint, would hate anybody. Misogyny, the word literally means hatred of women. But that was certainly one of my motivations for writing my dissertation on Chrysostom and women. To clear him, let's say, of any possible remote charge of hating women. He loved the female saints. He honored them more, I really think, than the male saints, because he admired their valor, which is typically kind of a male characteristic. But he would say they're braver than any men sometimes in their gallant, defeating the devil in spiritual warfare. He praises the Old Testament saints, especially the women, so highly. The New Testament saints, the same way. And it always amazed me that one of his main translators, in the footnotes, just kept bringing this thing up, that he doesn't appreciate women. It was just astounding. Now, he repeated that stereotype, even as he's translating Chrysostom's praise of these women described in the scriptures. So he absolutely appreciated and fully understood the absolute equality in human nature of men and women, their absolutely identical capacity for spiritual growth. But at the same time, he certainly realized that Adam was formed first, then Eve. There is a certain prioritizing, a certain hierarchy. And it's just such a shame that in our current times, the very word hierarchy is maligned. The very word patriarchy is so maligned. And the tragedy is that patriarchy oftentimes has not been lived out in a truly Christian way, which in our Orthodox understanding is in terms of servanthood. The husband, for instance, assumes the ultimate responsibility in the material and spiritual welfare of the family. To me, that's the heart, in one line, of male headship in the family. This particular responsibility to care for his wife and his children, to make sure, kind of the buck stops here, to make sure he's providing for them materially and maybe even more important, spiritually, to make sure we have morning and evening prayers, for instance, to make sure we get to church. So this is what patriarchy is meant to be all about. And the same thing in the church. The bishops, the priests, they undertake this really severe, heavy burden to have that ultimate responsibility, to bear it for the spiritual well-being, right, of their flock, all the men and women and children of their flock, for whose souls they will be required. They will have to answer for on the day of judgment. So as I think I heard my wife saying earlier in her interview, who would desire really such an extra responsibility when the main thing is to grow in holiness and to grow in the ways of salvation. It's a lot easier when you don't have that extra responsibility. So it's a gift. I think we really all should understand male headship in the church is a gift to all the rest of the men and to all the women. We don't have to worry. We don't have to bear that responsibility. We can just sit, stand, whatever, and pray in the services, which is the most important thing, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
We don't have to wonder about what to do next in the service. What am I going to preach about? Or even the administrative things, fundraising to keep the lights on and so on. All of those responsibilities, the bishops and the priests assume for us. And I think it could also be said if the men didn't have to do it, a lot of times they just wouldn't. I think we can all acknowledge women are, generally speaking, more disposed, more spiritually attuned, just I think by nature. And so men, they need that extra kick somehow to get them in gear. And God assures this happens through mandating that only men can be bishops and priests and deacons, because the diaconate is the first step towards the priesthood. And to have deaconesses serving, there's no evidence that they ever did serve liturgically in the early church when there were deaconesses. No evidence they ever served liturgically. To see them up there would be confusing. And of course, in our time, to ever guarantee that having female deacons would in no way be a move towards having female priests. It's utterly impossible, in our day and age, that is so intent on equality of men and women. And it reminds me really the fundamental mistake of feminism is assuming that because we have absolute identity of nature, right, human nature, men and women, that we share equally. The assumption then is, well, if we share human nature equally, we must have equality, identity, even sameness of function. See, that's the prime error. And all you have to do is look at our anatomy to realize God made us as similar as he did make us. He also made us radically different. The female body is designed especially, of course, for conceiving and bearing children and then nurturing them. So different from the male role in reproduction, right? So we cherish the differences as well as the similarities of the two sexes, and this is primal for us. This is bedrock theology, bedrock understanding. There only were, and ever will be two sexes, male and female, as it says in the book of Genesis. So there is a certain hierarchy with male headship, and that's why I think preserving the male headship in the church, male priesthood, is even more important in our own time as a proclamation of this wonderful difference of the sexes and these two, this basic difference, in our calling, what God has, the ways that God has called us to serve him and his people.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Well, and you might have be familiar with this study that I can't recall where it was, if it was Pew, somewhere like that, found that the influence of fathers going to church was so much more substantial than that of mothers
yes,
on whether or not children would go to church and end up staying in church.
yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. Just a tremendously striking difference.
Yeah,
If the father takes the children to church, a much higher percentage of those kids will continue to go. If the mother takes them, much less of a chance. I mean, of course, that's great to get them there one way or another, right? But it means so much more somehow at gut level in those kids,
it's
especially
a
maybe
mysterious
the
thing.
boys,
Yeah,
if their
yeah,
daddy does it, this is meant for me as well. If mommy does it, well, maybe yes, maybe not so much. Yeah, the fathers, oh, please, all our fathers, take that role, right? God
yeah.
gives you that role to assure the spiritual as well as the material well-being of your wife and children.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
absolutely. Yeah,
Good. And
yeah.
um, how about the charges of anti-Semitism that this kind of cropped up recently with someone in my parish, and
Mm.
um, anyway, I would love to hear your response. Yeah.
Yes, that charge mostly comes from only one series of sermons. He doesn't talk about the Jews, the contemporary Jews of his time, very much at all throughout his preaching and his essays. Um, very very little, but there is one series of several sermons where he's addressing the problem of some members of his flock, undoubtedly the more nominal ones, right, who are getting attracted to the outdoor festivals, apparently, that the Jews of Antioch and Constantinople uh, were involved with. And we really do need to remember, again, context means so much. The Jewish the Jewish um, communities in Antioch and Constantinople were sizable in his day, uh, if not maybe even a little powerful, uh, because they always seem to succeed financially, gifted along that line. And they would have these outdoor festivals, maybe processions somehow, and he would see some of his flock getting tempted to participate in these Jewish uh, uh, celebrations. And above all, his concern is to keep his flock safe spiritually, safely in the arms of Christ, right? Uh, he's going to be on guard for anything that might lure any of his people away from their life in Christ. So, in a setting like that, well, um, and of course, we also need to remember with his rhetoric a certain kind of uh, vividness, uh, even sometimes exaggeration. It's expected, in the preaching. So it's no wonder that he may get a little carried away. Yes, we can admit that maybe um, in his rhetoric concerning uh, these Jewish celebrations. Uh, I mean, even St. Paul himself warned the Judaizers, "Oh, who has bewitched you? You're starting to fall back into certain Jewish practices." So it's a pastoral threat to his. It's a threat to his people, and he has to respond pastorally. And if it takes some exaggeration in how frustrating it is, and it really was frustrating that the Jews kept resisting their own resisting receiving Jesus of Nazareth as their Messiah. Some of his rhetoric probably does reflect some of that frustration, but he's going to do everything he can to protect his flock. This is centuries before the Holocaust. It's just it's not fair, it's not right, it's not proper to judge his rhetoric by 20th century standards. That's another thing to remember. And also along this line, I like to recommend a book by Robert Wilkin called John Chrysostom and the Jews. He's an Anglican scholar, University of Virginia. Some years ago, he writes this book really defending Chrysostom from this charge of anti-Semitism, explaining the context of those sermons that can be maybe more properly entitled against the Judaizers rather than just against the Jews. He of course, as a saint, he's yearning for their salvation. He is not despising them as people in any way. He's yearning for them to embrace the Messiah that came first of all to them, and was a Jew himself.
Yeah. Good.
So it's a tragedy, really, if people get deflected from all the glorious things he says. Maybe he's not so. Maybe he could have said a few things better, but that's 1% of. What about the other 99% of glorious things he says about gospel, the salvation history and life in the church and Christian life in general? Wow, you're going to ignore that because of
Right.
maybe a certain problematic thing with the Jews?
Yeah.
Let's give them a break a little bit, even if it comes to that. I would say.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, in our culture, as you know, all it takes is one tweet to destroy your reputation.
It's a shame. It's really a shame.